Imagine spending your whole life planning the perfect revenge, only for it to backfire spectacularly. Meet John Lyshitski, a career criminal with just one goal: to ruin the life of the man who ruined his. But when fate flips the script, he finds himself stuck in prison with the wrong guy. What was supposed to be a sweet act of vengeance turns into a hilarious survival game behind bars, where the real criminals aren't just the inmates. From questionable cellmates to toilet wine business ventures, John and his new buddy will have to figure out how to survive the madness of prison life. John Lyshitski has just been released from prison. After his third stint since childhood, he's been drawn to the dark side. 8 years ago, John was driving a van carrying a massive lottery check, but he never got to cash it. The judge pronounced him guilty, declaring society needs to be protected from
worthless scum like you.
John was sentenced to 7 years in a juvenile facility. This harsh sentence turned him into a desperate criminal at 18. John tried to rob mail carriers, but emptied his gun while attempting to intimidate them. He received a 4-year sentence. The judge even remarked that if stupidity were a crime, John would have gotten a life sentence. 6 months after serving his term, the same judge sent John back to prison for car theft upon his release.
Next time you steal a car, check to see if there are lights on the roof.
John decided to take revenge on the judge, but the man had passed away 3 days earlier.
3 days!
John got frustrated. He shot up a phone booth in anger. At a bar, he came across an article stating that the judge's son, Nelson Biederman, was opening a memorial. John saw this as an opportunity for revenge. While Nelson delivered a speech, John broke into his car, emptying an inhaler and stealing some change, even spitting into Nelson's coffee. Nelson turned out to be an entitled jerk who squandered money and yelled at the directors of his father's foundation. John tailed him, watching him closely. Nelson, an asthmatic, frantically searched for a new inhaler after discovering his was empty. He stormed into a pharmacy, knocking over shelves in a panic. The store owner shouted, "Thief!" Nelson finally found an inhaler, but the shopkeeper and his wife mistook him for an armed robber, and chaos erupted as John added fuel to the fire. Firing his gun, the shopkeeper's wife retaliated by shooting Nelson with a shotgun. The entire incident was caught on camera. The board of directors, fed up with Nelson, refused to help him, claiming legal advice suggested he plead guilty. Nelson, abandoned, faced trial. At court, John sat among the audience. Nelson, leaning on his father's reputation, hoped to manipulate the judge. Unfortunately for him, the judge despised people like him and insisted the trial follow the law. Nelson's fate rested in the hands of a jury, whom he deemed a group of idiots, not far from the truth. Nelson's attorney, Dwayne, delivered an absurd defense, referencing films like Jurassic Park. The jury found Nelson guilty of attempted robbery.
Nelson Biederman, guilty.
You mean guilty?
It kind of looked like it was a cue.
Sentencing him to 3 to 5 years at Rosemore Prison. John imagined the wealthy brat being beaten and abused in prison but found little satisfaction. He wanted to cause Nelson pain himself. When 2 undercover cops tried to buy drugs from John, he pretended not to notice their disguise and willingly got himself arrested. His goal was to be sent to Rosemore to exact his revenge on Nelson. Negotiating with the judge, John ensured his sentence aligned with Nelson's and even requested the same prison. On the prison bus, John immediately struck up a conversation with Nelson, suggesting they share a cell. Grateful for the kindness, Nelson agreed, as other prisoners treated him coldly. The prison warden, introducing himself to the new inmates, asked if anyone claimed to be innocent. When one did, he was swiftly struck with a rifle butt. The warden sarcastically advised anyone with complaints to write them down, roll the paper into a tube, and shove it where the sun doesn't shine. John, who knew the guards well, bribed one to share a cell with Nelson. Meanwhile, Nelson trembled as he walked past shouting inmates. When he finally reached his tiny cell, he sat on the floor and burst into tears. John warned him to stop crying or he wouldn't last the week. He told Nelson to look tough, but Nelson's attempt looked more like a strained grimace. Maintaining a prisoner costs $54 per day in USA, totaling $28 billion annually. John joked that it might be cheaper to just let people steal car stereos. At lunch, John explained prison dynamics, pointing out Leonard as the top dog. He warned Nelson to leave the table by 12:15, but Nelson got distracted, lost in memories of college. Right in front of them, Leonard stabbed another inmate. When the guard, Shanahan, hit Nelson and demanded to know who did it, Nelson, following John's advice, immediately pointed at Leonard. Back in the cell, John scolded him, saying,
"Never narc on somebody. I mean, haven't you seen any prison movies?"
One of the most interesting places in prison is the shower. A prisoner named Barry took an interest in Nelson and started flirting with him. But John stepped in, claimed Nelson as his own, and threatened another inmate with a shiv.
Well, Philly's all mine. You can look, but don't touch.
Nelson awkwardly thanked John but quickly realized prison life was a nightmare. As he struggled to process the harsh realities, his lawyer delivered more bad news. He had no access to his father's foundation funds since he'd been suspended as chairman for the duration of his sentence. Meanwhile, John ensured Nelson's misery. He bribed one inmate to punch him in the face regularly and another to sneak disgusting things into his food at the cafeteria. In the showers, Barry continued his relentless flirting. The massive inmate was so smitten that he even offered to buy Nelson at any price. Eventually, Barry arranged a private meeting. Guard Shanahan, clearly in on the plan, called John out for trash duty and conveniently left Nelson's cell unlocked. Within moments, other inmates grabbed Nelson, threw a bag over his head, and dragged him to a dimly lit room decorated with candles and garlands. Barry entered, grinning, and offered Nelson a glass of wine, which he proudly admitted was brewed in a toilet. But the mood quickly shifted when Nelson made the mistake of lying about Barry's weight. Barry pressed a knife to his throat, and things took a much darker turn. Barry, who despised dishonesty, declared that Nelson was now his property. He told Nelson he would have to please him but promised to take things slow. Barry even leaned in for a romantic nose rub, saying they'd start with a kiss. Later, as Nelson rode to his pen pal, who turned out to be a young boy, an Aryan Brotherhood member urinated on him. This was a message from Leonard, who had just been released from solitary confinement. John informed Nelson that other inmates were placing bets on where Leonard would kill him. Naive as ever, Nelson approached Leonard to apologize, but Leonard immediately stabbed him in the leg with a fork. Leonard revealed that Nelson had offended him just as much as his own father had, and he had killed his father in the same way he intended to kill Nelson.
I'm gonna kill you the same way.
Meanwhile, Barry continued to show his affections. John suggested Nelson hide from Leonard in solitary confinement. To get him there, John stood behind Nelson and punched a guard. The plan worked, and Nelson was sent to solitary. However, as time dragged on, Nelson began to suffer from hallucinations in isolation. After just 2 days, Nelson had enough and sought out the prison's chemist to buy something to end his life. The chemist sold him a boat cleaner and a syringe. Nelson confided his plan to his pen pal, expressing his rage by saying he wanted to line up his tormentors and cut off their manhoods. Unbeknownst to him, his young pen pal read the letter aloud to his entire class. Soon after, Leonard stormed into Nelson's cell, doused him with gasoline, and lamented that Nelson wasn't Jewish, as it would have made burning him alive more satisfying. Surprisingly, Nelson fought back, injuring Leonard during the struggle. Leonard mistook the syringe of boat cleaner for drugs, injected himself, and immediately dropped dead. John was particularly stunned. This was not part of his plan. From that day forward, Nelson's life in prison took a sharp turn. The Aryan Brotherhood now backed him, and he rose to a position of power, able to order anyone around. However, unresolved romantic matters remained. Barry had fallen in love with Nelson over the months, and his feelings were hurt by Nelson's lack of reciprocation. In an emotional outburst, Barry nearly strangled Nelson in the bathroom. Nelson, feeling guilty for breaking Barry's heart, forgave him. When Aryan Brotherhood members burst into the bathroom to protect Nelson, he stopped them, asking them to leave Barry alone. John accidentally ended up in solitary confinement himself. Upon his release, he discovered that Nelson was now running the entire prison. Nelson had even organized a musical performed by the inmates. John grew increasingly frustrated with how everything had turned out. Nelson, however, expressed gratitude, thanking John for preparing him for life in prison. John's revenge plan had completely fallen apart. The next day was Nelson's parole hearing. To prepare for the big day, Nelson was assisted by his new friend, Barry. John entered their cell and handed Nelson a farewell gift, an already opened soda can, wishing him luck at the hearing. Suspicious, Nelson hesitated, but John pretended to be offended. To prove his innocence, John took a sip. Nelson apologized and drank the rest of the soda, only to collapse moments later. John, gagging from the small sip he had taken, vomited in the toilet. With the help of an accomplice, he carried Nelson's unconscious body away. The following day at the parole hearing, Nelson appeared unaware that the words, "White Power," were written across his forehead. The committee immediately denied his release. Nelson lashed out at his cellmate, attacking him. During the fight, under pressure, the cellmate admitted that all the hostility was because of Nelson's father, the judge.
I knew your dad, the judge, who made me who I am today.
Guard Shanahan, annoyed that the inmates had a fight without him, reminded everyone that he organized the fight schedule. He declared they would settle their issues with a death match on Friday in the yard. The loser would die, and Shanahan would kill the winner himself to maintain order. A supervisor was assigned to monitor them before the fight. Other inmates eagerly placed bets on gruesome outcomes such as skull fractures or ears being bitten off. Nelson also received a visit from Barry, who had been deemed reformed by the parole board, thanks entirely to Nelson. However, Barry confessed that he couldn't be happy without Nelson, calling him his fish. Barry offered to help Nelson escape, but Nelson refused, saying,
The only way that I'm getting out of here is in a body bag.
Barry in tears suggested,
Then it better be a body bag for two, goddammit.
Nelson devised a plan. He contacted Dwayne and revealed that if he stayed in prison, he would transfer control of his father's foundation to his son, who would run it until Nelson's release. To execute this, Nelson adopted a fellow inmate.
What the hell you doing in my office?
Meanwhile, the prison warden learned of the death match and placed a $50 bet on Nelson, the newcomer. On Friday, the yard was packed as inmates cheered for the fight. The rules were simple: the first to die loses. Nelson armed himself with a screwdriver, while his opponent came more prepared. A shiv was thrown into the crowd, and another broke against Nelson's improvised body armor. Finally, both fighters resorted to their secret weapons, syringes filled with brightly colored chemicals. Nelson landed a fatal blow, but his opponent managed to strike him in return. Shanahan declared it a tie and ordered the bodies to be removed before they started stinking. Nelson was buried, leaving his adopted son as the sole heir to an $8 million fortune. However, Barry refused to leave the cemetery. That evening, he dug up Nelson's grave with a shovel. Flashback. Earlier, Nelson had obtained a special chemical from the prison chemist to put himself into a coma. Barry had bribed the coroner to ensure the plan worked. As Nelson prepared to leave, Barry reminded him of their agreement to rescue John, saying,
If it wasn't for this, we would have never met.
With that, they settled their differences. A year later, Barry and Nelson opened a winery called Duckling. However, their wine wasn't exactly a hit. When one critic gave it a bad review, John and some former inmates, now working at the winery, intimidated him. The critic promised to give the wine a perfect score of 100, even though the bitter concoction with a hint of ammonia was disliked by everyone, including the winemakers themselves. That's a wrap for today's recap. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more movie breakdowns. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next one.